The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on Sweetwater Creek, as Sarah Winters struggled with two heavy wooden buckets, her slender arms straining against their weight. The water sloshed dangerously close to the rims as sweat trickled down her flushed face, dampening the collar of her faded blue calico dress. July 1875 in the Arizona Territory was unforgiving, and at 22, Sarah had learned that survival meant pushing through exhaustion. "Miss, you ought not be carrying those in this heat." The deep voice startled her, causing water to spill over the edge of one bucket and onto her worn leather boots. Sarah turned to find a tall stranger astride a dappled gray horse, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Dust coated his dark trail clothes, suggesting he had ridden far. "I manage just fine, sir," she replied, lifting her chin despite her aching arms. 3 years on her own had taught her not to accept help too readily from strangers, especially not in a place like Sweetwater. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, a striking blue against his tanned skin, held no threat, only concern. "Name's Wyatt Colton," he said, removing his hat. "And I'd be obliged if you'd let me take care of those buckets for you. This heat's enough to fell a buffalo." Sarah hesitated, studying him. His beard was neatly trimmed, and despite the trail dust, there was something dignified about him. Unlike the rough men who frequented the saloon down the street, he met her gaze directly, respectfully. "I'm Sarah Winters," she finally said, "and I suppose I wouldn't mind the help, Mr. Colton, though it's only a short walk to my place." Wyatt smiled, revealing straight white teeth. "Please, just Wyatt." He reached for the buckets, his fingers brushing against hers momentarily. "Lead the way, Miss Winters." Sarah released the buckets, suddenly aware of the relief in her arms and the rapid beating of her heart that had nothing to do with exertion. "It's the small house just past the general store," she said, pointing down the dusty street. As they walked side by side, Sarah stole glances at the stranger. His gait was steady and purposeful, the buckets seemingly weightless in his grasp. A gun hung at his hip, not unusual in these parts, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence that differed from the swaggering gunmen who occasionally passed through town. "You're new to Sweetwater," Sarah observed, not a question but a statement. Wyatt nodded. "Just arrived." "Looking for work and a place to settle for a spell." "There's not much here," Sarah admitted. "The mine's been declining and folks have been leaving for Silver City or Tucson." "Sometimes quiet is what a man needs," Wyatt replied cryptically. They reached the small clapboard house that Sarah had called home since arriving in Sweetwater. A modest garden struggled to survive in the hard ground beside it, the plants wilting under the relentless sun. "You can set those down on the porch," she instructed, climbing the 3 wooden steps to her door. Wyatt carefully placed the buckets down, straightening to his full height. "That's quite a garden you're fighting for," he remarked, nodding toward the rows of vegetables. Sarah sighed. "It's a losing battle in this heat, I'm afraid." "I've seen techniques used by farmers in Texas that might help," Wyatt offered. "Ways to shade the plants during the hottest part of the day." Sarah's instinct was to politely decline, to maintain the careful distance she kept from everyone in town. But something in Wyatt's earnest expression made her hesitate. "I could show you sometime," he added, placing his hat back on his head, "if you'd permit it." Sarah found herself nodding. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Call Wyatt." A smile spread across his face, transforming his serious features. "Tomorrow, then. I'll be getting settled at the boarding house tonight." "Tomorrow," Sarah agreed, surprised at her own willingness to see this stranger again. Wyatt tipped his hat and turned to retrieve his horse, which had obediently followed them. Sarah watched him go, puzzled by the unusual flutter in her chest. She had long ago decided that Sweetwater was merely a stopping point, a place to gather enough money to continue west to California. Getting to know anyone, especially a man like Wyatt Colton, wasn't part of that plan. Yet as she carried the first bucket inside, Sarah found herself glancing toward the street, watching his tall figure lead the gray horse toward the boarding house at the edge of town. The next morning arrived with the same relentless heat. Sarah had risen before dawn to tend to her washing business, scrubbing the shirts and linens that provided her modest income. By mid-morning, her hands were red and raw from lye soap and cold water. She was hanging the last sheet on the line when she spotted Wyatt approaching, his hat in his hands. He wore a clean cotton shirt today, and his dark hair was damp, as if freshly washed. "Good morning, Miss Winters," he called, stopping at the edge of her small yard. "Mr. Colton," she acknowledged, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're prompt." "My father always said a man's word is his bond," Wyatt replied. "I said tomorrow, and here I am." Sarah couldn't help but smile at his earnestness. "Well, I appreciate you coming. The garden is around back." She led him to where her vegetables struggled against the Arizona climate. Tomato plants drooped despite the morning watering, and the bean vines looked parched and yellow. "You've worked hard on this," Wyatt observed, kneeling to examine the soil. "But the sun's just too harsh during midday." "I water morning and evening," Sarah explained, "but it never seems enough." Wyatt nodded thoughtfully. "What you need is shade cloth." He pointed to several tall stakes at the edge of the garden. "Were you planning to use those?" "For the beans to climb," Sarah confirmed. "Perfect. We can create a canopy using those stakes and some lightweight fabric. It'll filter the sun during the hottest hours but still let enough light through." For the next hour, Wyatt worked methodically, fashioning a frame from the stakes and some spare lumber he found behind Sarah's house. When the structure was complete, he stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "Now we just need the cloth," he said. "Do you have any old sheets or lightweight fabric you could spare?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I have some flour sacks I've been saving." "Would those work?" "Perfectly." Together they stretched the fabric over the frame, securing it with twine. When they finished, the garden was dappled with gentle shade, the plants already seeming to stand a little straighter. "This is wonderful," Sarah said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "How did you learn such things?" Wyatt's expression softened. "My family had a small farm in East Texas before the war. My mother was determined to grow vegetables despite the heat. She was creative with her solutions." "Was?" Sarah asked gently, noting his use of past tense. Sadness flickered across Wyatt's features. "They passed during a fever outbreak while I was away fighting. By the time I returned, there was nothing left for me there." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, understanding loss all too well. "The war took much from many." Wyatt nodded, his eyes distant for a moment before he seemed to collect himself. "And you, Miss Winters, what brought you to Sweetwater?" Sarah hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing her story. But Wyatt had been honest with her, and something about his steady presence made her want to reciprocate. "I came west after losing my parents to influenza in '72. I was 19, with no family left in Pennsylvania. I had an aunt in California who offered to take me in, but I've been working my way there slowly." She gestured to the washing line. "Laundry pays the same in every town, it seems." "And Sweetwater became more than a stopping point?" Wyatt asked. Sarah shrugged. "It became familiar, safe enough, but I still plan to reach California eventually." Wyatt studied her for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes the journey changes us more than the destination," he observed. Before Sarah could respond, the church bell began to toll, marking noon. "I've taken up your whole morning," Wyatt said apologetically. "You must have work to return to." "The washing's done for today," Sarah assured him. "I was planning to make some lunch." "It's simple fare, but you're welcome to join me, as thanks for your help." Surprise and pleasure crossed Wyatt's face. "I'd be honored, Miss Winters." "Sarah," she corrected him with a small smile. "If I'm to call you Wyatt, then you should call me Sarah." As they walked toward the house, Sarah wondered at her own actions. She had kept to herself for 3 years in Sweetwater, politely rebuffing the occasional invitation from townspeople. Yet here she was, inviting a man she'd met just yesterday into her home. The small kitchen was neat but sparsely furnished. Sarah busied herself preparing a simple meal of cornbread and bean soup while Wyatt sat at the worn wooden table, his large frame making the small room seem even smaller. "So what brings you to Sweetwater specifically?" Sarah asked as she placed a steaming bowl before him. "You mentioned looking for work." Wyatt thanked her for the food before answering. "I've been working as a ranch hand, most recently up in Colorado, but I'm looking to settle somewhere, maybe start something of my own. Heard there might be affordable land around these parts, with folks leaving for the bigger silver strikes." "There's truth to that," Sarah acknowledged. "The Wilcox place just north of town has been empty for months now. 10 acres with a decent well, from what I've heard." They ate companionably, the conversation flowing more easily than Sarah would have expected. Wyatt spoke of his years working on ranches across the territory, and Sarah found herself sharing stories of her journey west, the colorful characters she'd met, the challenges she'd overcome. As Wyatt prepared to leave after the meal, he paused at the door. "I'd like to check on that shade structure tomorrow, make sure it's holding properly," he said. "If that's acceptable to you." Sarah knew it was an excuse to return, just as she knew she should politely decline. Instead, she heard herself say, "That would be fine. I'll be doing washing in the morning, but afternoon would suit." The smile that lit Wyatt's face made something warm unfurl in Sarah's chest. "Until tomorrow, then," he said, placing his hat on his head and stepping into the bright afternoon sun. Sarah watched him go, her mind a confused tangle of thoughts. She had not planned on making connections in Sweetwater. She certainly hadn't planned on feeling this inexplicable pull toward a man she barely knew. Yet as she cleared away the lunch dishes, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow's afternoon with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. The days that followed established a pattern. Wyatt would appear at Sarah's house in the afternoon, often bringing small gifts, a bundle of wildflowers, fresh eggs from the boarding house chickens, or once, a packet of rare herb seeds he'd traded for at the general store. Together, they would work on improving her garden, repairing the sagging back steps of her house, or simply sitting on the porch talking as the worst of the day's heat dissipated. Sarah learned that Wyatt had fought for the Confederacy, though he spoke of it reluctantly and with no pride. He had spent the years since the war moving from place to place, working with horses primarily, developing a reputation as a skilled breaker of even the most difficult animals. "I've saved enough to make a start somewhere," he told her one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the distant mountains purple and gold. "I just needed to find the right place. And you think Sweetwater might be it?" Sarah asked, trying to ignore the hope that fluttered in her chest at the thought of him staying. Wyatt's gaze was steady as he looked at her. "I'm beginning to think so," he replied quietly. 2 weeks after their first meeting, Wyatt took Sarah to see the abandoned Wilcox property he was considering purchasing. They rode double on his gray gelding, Tempest, Sarah seated before Wyatt, acutely aware of his solid presence behind her, his arms on either side as he held the reins. The property was rough, but promising, a small, weathered cabin surrounded by scrubby grazing land, with a creek running along its eastern boundary. The previous owner had planted a stand of cottonwoods that provided welcome shade around the house. "It needs work," Wyatt acknowledged as he helped Sarah down from the horse. "But the bones are good. Water's reliable, according to the town records." Sarah walked toward the cabin, peering through the grimy windows. "It looks sound," she agreed, "though it could use a woman's touch inside." The words slipped out before she could consider their implication. Wyatt said nothing, but she felt his eyes on her, thoughtful and considering. They explored the property together, Wyatt pointing out where he would build corrals for the horses he hoped to raise, Sarah noting where a garden might thrive with the right care. For a few dreamlike hours, it was easy to imagine a life here, a shared life that Sarah had never allowed herself to envision. As they prepared to leave, Wyatt suddenly took her hand, his expression serious. "Sarah, I know you plan to continue to California someday," but a gunshot cracked the air, interrupting whatever Wyatt had been about to say. Instinctively, he pulled Sarah close, shielding her as he scanned the surroundings. "That came from town," he said, his body tense against hers. They mounted Tempest quickly, Wyatt urging the horse into a gallop as they headed back toward Sweetwater. As they approached, they could see people gathering in the street outside the saloon, voices raised in alarm. Wyatt helped Sarah down before dismounting himself. "Stay here," he instructed, but Sarah was already moving toward the crowd, concern overriding caution. Sheriff Mills stood on the saloon steps, his weathered face grim as he addressed the townspeople. "Everyone stay calm," he was saying as Sarah and Wyatt approached. "It was just a warning shot. No one's hurt." "What happened?" Wyatt asked, his hand resting protectively at the small of Sarah's back. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly at the newcomer, but he answered evenly. "Sam Foster claims Thomas Reed cheated at cards. Reed drew his gun when Foster called him out." Fired into the ceiling. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Thomas Reed was known as a hothead with a quick temper, especially when drinking. He'd caused trouble before, but never involving firearms. "I've got Reed locked up to cool off," the sheriff continued. "But there's something else you all should know. Got word from Silver City that the Blackwell gang was spotted heading this way. 3 men, led by Wade Blackwell himself." Sarah felt Wyatt stiffen beside her. The Blackwell gang was notorious throughout the territory, bank robbers who didn't hesitate to leave bodies behind. "They hit the bank in Silver City 2 days ago," Sheriff Mills explained. "Killed a teller who tried to sound the alarm. Our bank's small, but it might look like easy pickings to them." "What do you plan to do, Sheriff?" asked Mr. Henderson, the bank manager, his face pale with worry. "I've sent for help from the marshal's office in Tucson, but it could be days before anyone arrives. In the meantime, I'm asking for volunteers to help keep watch." Several men stepped forward immediately, local ranchers and shopkeepers determined to protect their town. Sarah wasn't surprised when Wyatt joined them, his expression resolute. "I've had experience with men like Blackwell," he told the sheriff quietly. "I'd like to help." Sheriff Mills assessed Wyatt with a practiced eye, noting the way he carried himself and the well-worn holster at his hip. "Appreciate it, Mr. Colton. We'll set up a rotation, keep men posted at the bank and at the main roads into town." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah touched Wyatt's arm. "Be careful," she said, unable to mask the concern in her voice. Wyatt covered her hand with his own. "I will. Let me see you home before I meet with the sheriff." That night, Sarah found sleep elusive. She lay awake, listening to the occasional footsteps of the men patrolling the streets, thinking of Wyatt out there in the darkness. In just 2 short weeks, he had become important to her in ways she hadn't thought possible. The prospect of him facing dangerous outlaws made her stomach knot with fear. Dawn brought no sign of the Blackwell gang, but tension hung over Sweetwater like the gathering storm clouds on the horizon. Sarah went about her washing as usual, though her eyes constantly strayed to the street, watching for any unfamiliar riders. Wyatt appeared mid-morning, looking tired but unharmed. "No sign of them yet," he reported, accepting the cup of coffee Sarah offered. "But the sheriff thinks they're likely waiting for the right moment. The bank received a large deposit yesterday payroll for the remaining mine workers." "How long will you need to keep watch?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "As long as necessary," Wyatt replied. He hesitated, then reached across the table to take her hand. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you in case—" "Don't," Sarah interrupted, her fingers tightening around his. "Don't speak as if something's going to happen to you." Wyatt's blue eyes were solemn. "I just want you to know that meeting you has changed things for me. I've been drifting for so long, never staying anywhere because nowhere felt right. But here with you." He took a breath. "I'm thinking about more than just passing through." Sarah's heart raced at his words. "I've been thinking the same," she admitted softly. "My plans to leave for California don't seem as urgent as they once did." A smile transformed Wyatt's tired face. He leaned forward, his intent clear in his eyes. Sarah met him halfway, her lips touching his in a gentle kiss that held both promise and question. When they separated, Wyatt's expression was tender but serious. "When this business with the Blackwell gang is over, we have more to discuss," he said. "But for now, I need you to be careful. Stay close to home if you can." Sarah nodded, though the independent streak that had carried her halfway across the country balked at the instruction. "I have deliveries to make this afternoon, laundry to the boarding house and the doctor's office, but I'll be quick about it." Wyatt looked as if he wanted to argue but thought better of it. "Just keep your eyes open," he said instead. "And if you see anything suspicious, I'll find you or the sheriff immediately," Sarah promised. Wyatt kissed her once more before leaving to resume his watch. Sarah touched her fingers to her lips after he'd gone, still feeling the warmth of his kiss, the reality of what had just passed between them slowly sinking in. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered overhead, promising a rare summer storm. Sarah hurried along the boardwalk with her basket of clean laundry, anxious to complete her deliveries before the rain began. The streets were unusually quiet, most townspeople choosing to stay indoors with outlaws potentially lurking nearby. She had just left the boarding house and was heading toward Dr. Wilson's office when she noticed 3 riders at the far end of the street. They moved slowly, deliberately, their faces obscured by bandanas pulled up over their noses. Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized what she was seeing. The Blackwell gang had arrived. Instinctively, Sarah stepped back into the shadow of the general store's awning, watching as the men dismounted outside the bank. They moved with the confidence of predators, seemingly unconcerned about being seen. One man, taller than the others and wearing a black duster despite the heat, gestured sharply toward the bank doors. Sarah needed to raise the alarm, but the sheriff's office was across the street, past where the men stood. She glanced around desperately, spotting the livery stable a short distance away. Wyatt had mentioned he would be watching from there during this part of the day. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah slipped between buildings, using the approaching storm's shadows as cover. Thunder rumbled in the distance as she reached the back of the livery. She slipped inside through the rear door, the familiar smell of hay and horses filling her nostrils. "Wyatt." She called softly, stepping carefully past stalls of nervous horses. A movement near the hayloft ladder caught her attention. Wyatt appeared, rifle in hand, his expression shifting from alertness to concern when he saw her. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" He climbed down quickly, reaching her in a few long strides. "They're here," she whispered urgently. "3 men, just like the sheriff said. They're at the bank now." Wyatt's face hardened. "Are you certain it's them?" Faces covered, moving like they owned the town. Who else would it be? Wyatt nodded grimly. "I need to alert the others. There's a signal we arranged." He moved toward the front of the livery where a small window overlooked the main street. "Stay here," he instructed. "Stay hidden." But as Wyatt raised his rifle to tap out a pattern on the window frame, a warning to the other men stationed around town, a shot rang out. The window shattered, and Wyatt dropped to the floor, pulling Sarah down with him. "They must have spotted me," he muttered, checking to make sure she was unharmed. "Or they're just being cautious, shooting at any movement." More gunfire erupted outside the sheriff and the other volunteers responding to the Blackwell gang's presence. Sarah could hear shouts and the frightened whinnying of horses as the animals reacted to the chaos. "I need to get out there," Wyatt said, his expression torn as he looked at Sarah. "The sheriff's outnumbered." "Go," Sarah urged, though fear made her voice shake. "I'll stay here." Wyatt cupped her face with one hand, his touch gentle despite the urgency of the moment. "Stay low, stay hidden," he repeated. Then he was gone, slipping out the side door of the livery, his gun drawn. Sarah huddled behind a stack of hay bales, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard over the gunfire outside. The minutes stretched endlessly as the shootout continued. She could distinguish at least 5 different guns, their reports echoing off the buildings of Sweetwater's Main Street. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise had been. Sarah strained to hear voices, footsteps, anything that would tell her what had happened, who had prevailed. The livery door creaked open. Sarah pressed herself further into her hiding place, scarcely daring to breathe. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by the metallic click of spurs. "Sarah." Wyatt's voice, strained but unmistakable, called softly. "Sarah, it's over. You can come out." She emerged cautiously, relief flooding through her at the sight of him, dusty, a graze on his cheekbone, bleeding slightly, but alive and standing. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to him. "Are you hurt?" Wyatt shook his head, gathering her into his arms. "Just a scratch. The sheriff's been hit in the shoulder, but the doctor says he'll recover." His arms tightened around her. "We got 2 of them, Blackwell himself and one of his men. The third fled, but he won't get far. He took a bullet in the leg." Sarah sagged against him, the tension of the past hour draining away, leaving her trembling. "I was so afraid," she whispered against his chest. "So was I," Wyatt admitted, stroking her hair. "When I saw you in here, knowing what was about to happen." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes intense. "Sarah, life's too uncertain and too precious to waste time. I know we haven't known each other long, but I know what I feel." Outside, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, drumming on the livery roof. The storm that had been threatening all day had finally broken, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing between them, one of emotion and honesty and possibilities. "I was going to wait, do this properly," Wyatt continued, "but today showed me that waiting isn't always wise." He took her hands in his. "Sarah Winters, I've fallen in love with you. I want to buy that property we saw, make it into something special, but only if you'll consider sharing it with me." Sarah's breath caught. Part of her thought this was too fast, too soon. But a larger part recognized the truth in what he said about life's uncertainty. She had been drifting since losing her parents, telling herself she was heading toward a destination while really just avoiding putting down roots anywhere, afraid of more loss. "I love you too," she said softly, the words feeling both new and familiar on her tongue. "And yes, I'll consider it." More than consider it. Wyatt's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. He bent to kiss her, a kiss full of promise and relief and joy. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the dust and gunsmoke from Sweetwater's streets, while inside the livery, Sarah and Wyatt began to plan a future neither had imagined just weeks before. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The attempted bank robbery became the talk of Sweetwater, with Sheriff Mills' arm in a sling, but his spirit undiminished, recounting the shootout to anyone who would listen. Wyatt was hailed as a hero for his part in defending the town, earning him respect and acceptance among the townspeople who had initially viewed the newcomer with suspicion. With the threat of the Blackwell gang eliminated, Wyatt turned his attention to more personal matters. He formalized his offer on the Wilcox property, shaking hands with Mr. Henderson, who acted as agent for the absent owner. "It'll be yours as soon as the paperwork comes back from the county seat," the bank manager assured him. "Should be about 2 weeks." Sarah, meanwhile, found herself contemplating a future very different from the one she had envisioned. The aunt in California, her last remaining relative, had been more of an abstract destination than a real connection. Her letter accepting Sarah had been brief and dutiful rather than warm. In contrast, what she had found with Wyatt felt solid and true, a connection based on genuine understanding and shared values. A week after the shootout, Wyatt invited Sarah to ride out to what would soon be his property, their property, if the careful conversations they'd been having came to fruition. "I want to show you something," he said mysteriously as he helped her onto Tempest. The summer storm had broken the worst of the heat, and the desert landscape looked refreshed, patches of wildflowers blooming where rain had collected. When they reached the property, Wyatt led Sarah not toward the cabin but to a rise overlooking the creek, where a large cottonwood spread its branches. Beneath the tree, a blanket had been laid out, and upon it sat a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "A picnic?" Sarah asked, delighted by the surprise. Wyatt nodded, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I thought we should celebrate properly," he said, helping her down from the horse. "This is a special spot, best view on the property." They settled on the blanket, and Wyatt unpacked the basket, revealing bread, cheese, preserves, and even a bottle of wine, luxuries rarely seen in Sweetwater. "Where did you get all this?" Sarah asked, amazed at the spread. "Mrs. Tillman at the boarding house helped," Wyatt admitted with a smile. "She seems quite invested in our happiness." They ate companionably, talking of their plans for the property, which rooms in the cabin needed the most attention, where to plant the garden, how many horses Wyatt hoped to eventually keep. It felt surreal to Sarah, discussing a shared future with this man who had been a stranger just weeks ago. Yet it also felt right in a way nothing had since before her parents' deaths. As they finished the meal, Wyatt grew quiet, his expression thoughtful as he gazed out over the land that would soon be his. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, reaching for his hand. Wyatt turned to her, his eyes serious. "I'm thinking that I never expected to find you, Sarah Winters. I came to Sweetwater looking for land, not love," he smiled ruefully. "And then I saw you struggling with those water buckets in the heat, and something just shifted. For me too," Sarah admitted, "though I fought it at first." "And now?" Wyatt asked, his voice gentle but intent. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Now I can't imagine leaving, can't imagine not being with you." Wyatt's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I've been carrying this for 3 days, waiting for the right moment," he said, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in its center. "It was my mother's. I've kept it all these years, never thinking I'd have someone to give it to." Sarah's breath caught as Wyatt slid from the blanket to kneel before her, the ring held between his fingers. "Sarah Winters, I know our acquaintance has been brief, but my heart is certain. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of building a life with me here?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she looked at this good, honorable man who had walked into her life and changed everything. The cautious voice that had kept her from forming attachments in Sweetwater was silent now, overwhelmed by the certainty of what she felt for Wyatt. "Yes," she said, her voice clear despite her tears. "Yes, I will marry you, Wyatt Colton." Wyatt slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if made for her. Then he gathered her into his arms, his kiss a promise of all that was to come. They were married 2 weeks later in Sweetwater's small church, with the entire town turning out to witness the union of the newcomer who had helped save their bank and the quiet laundress who had lived among them for 3 years without ever truly being known. Mrs. Tillman from the boarding house baked a wedding cake, and Mr. Henderson presented them with the deed to the Wilcox property as a wedding gift, the paperwork having arrived from the county seat just in time. That evening, Wyatt carried Sarah over the threshold of the cabin that was now truly theirs. They had spent the days leading up to the wedding making it habitable, cleaning, repairing, furnishing it with a mixture of Sarah's possessions and new items purchased with Wyatt's savings. "Welcome home, Mrs. Colton," Wyatt said, setting her gently on her feet in the main room, where a fire burned cheerfully in the stone hearth. "Home," Sarah repeated, savoring the word. After years of temporary lodgings and careful emotional distance, she had found a place to belong, not just a physical location, but in the heart of the man beside her. That night, as they lay together in their new bed, the sounds of the desert night surrounding them, Sarah reflected on the strange paths that had led them both to this moment. The war that had taken Wyatt's family, the illness that had claimed hers, the series of choices and chances that had brought them both to Sweetwater at precisely the same time. "What are you thinking?" Wyatt asked, his fingers gently tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "About fate," Sarah replied, nestling closer to him. "Do you believe in it?" Wyatt was silent for a moment, considering. "I believe that life offers us moments of possibility," he said finally, "crossroads where we can choose one path or another. But we have to recognize those moments when they come and be brave enough to choose. Like when you decided to help me with my water buckets," Sarah mused. "Exactly." Wyatt pressed a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made." The days turned to weeks, and the weeks to months. Autumn came to the Arizona territory, bringing cooler temperatures and a gentle golden light that bathed the landscape. Wyatt and Sarah settled into the rhythms of their new life together, working side by side to transform the neglected property into a home. Wyatt's expertise with horses proved valuable. He began by purchasing 3 mares from a rancher north of Sweetwater, animals with good bloodlines but behavioral issues their previous owner couldn't handle. With patience and skill, Wyatt retrained them, preparing to breed them the following spring. Sarah, meanwhile, transformed the cabin's interior, adding curtains, rag rugs, and the small touches that made the space truly theirs. She planted a fall garden, using the techniques Wyatt had shown her to protect the plants from the still considerable heat, and was rewarded with a bounty of vegetables that filled their root cellar. They hosted a harvest dinner in late October, inviting those who had become their friends in Sweetwater Sheriff Mills, now fully recovered from his wound, the Tillmans from the boarding house, Dr. Wilson and his wife, and several others who had welcomed them as a couple. "You've made something special here," Mrs. Tillman said admiringly as Sarah showed her around the property. "Hard to believe this is the same neglected place the Wilcoxes abandoned." "It's been a labor of love," Sarah replied, her gaze straying to where Wyatt stood with the men discussing his plans for expanding the horse breeding operation. "And it shows," Mrs. Tillman said knowingly. "In the place and in you, my dear. Marriage agrees with you." Sarah smiled, unable to deny it. She had blossomed in these months with Wyatt, finding confidence and joy she hadn't known was possible. The restlessness that had driven her for years had been replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. As winter approached, bringing surprisingly chilly nights to the desert, Sarah began to suspect a new blessing was on its way. Her monthly courses, always regular, failed to appear. Her dresses grew snug around the waist, and mornings often found her battling waves of nausea. She kept her suspicions to herself at first, waiting until she was certain before sharing the news with Wyatt. One evening in early December, as they sat before the fire after dinner, Sarah decided the time had come. "I have something to tell you," she said, her hands unconsciously cradling her still flat stomach. Wyatt looked up from the bridle he was mending, his expression curious. "What is it, love?" Sarah took a deep breath, suddenly nervous despite knowing how welcome this news would be. "I believe we're going to have a child come summer." Wyatt's face transformed, joy and wonder replacing his initial surprise. He set aside his work and moved to kneel before her chair, his hands covering hers where they rested on her abdomen. "A baby," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Our baby," Sarah nodded, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. "I'm quite certain. All the signs are there." Wyatt gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass. "Sarah," he whispered against her hair, "you have made me the happiest of men. First by becoming my wife, and now by making me a father." Later that night, as they lay in bed planning for this new addition to their family, Wyatt's hand protectively covering Sarah's stomach, she thought again of that scorching day in July when a stranger had offered to carry her water buckets. How different her life would have been if she had politely declined his help, as she had declined so many other offers of connection during her years in Sweetwater. "I was thinking," Wyatt said, interrupting her reflections. "If it's a boy, perhaps we could name him after your father. You've spoken so fondly of him." Touched by the suggestion, Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "William," she said softly. "His name was William, and yes, I would like that very much." "And if it's a girl," Wyatt asked, Sarah considered. "Maybe Elizabeth after your mother." Wyatt's eyes grew misty in the dim light. "She would have loved you," he said. "Almost as much as I do." Spring came early to the Arizona territory that year, bringing abundant rains that transformed the desert into a carpet of wildflowers. Sarah, now visibly carrying their child, moved more slowly but with a radiant happiness that everyone who saw her remarked upon. The horse breeding business was proving successful. The first foal had been born in February, a strong colt with promising conformation that already had neighboring ranchers inquiring about future breeding rights. 2 more mares were expected to deliver before summer, establishing the foundation of what Wyatt hoped would become a respected breeding program. In April, as Sarah entered her 7th month, Wyatt insisted on hiring help, a local girl named Maria to assist with household tasks, and a young man named Joseph to help with the increasingly demanding work of the growing horse operation. "You need to rest more," Wyatt told Sarah firmly when she initially protested the expense. "The doctor said so, and I won't have you or our child at risk because you're too stubborn to accept help." Sarah conceded, recognizing the wisdom in his concern. Her pregnancy had been healthy but tiring, and the summer heat would soon return, making her final months more challenging. May brought an unexpected letter from Sarah's aunt in California, responding belatedly to the news of Sarah's marriage that had been sent months earlier. The letter was stiff and formal, expressing surprise at Sarah's decision to remain in Arizona rather than continuing to California as planned. There was no warmth in the message, no genuine interest in Sarah's new life or happiness. "I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had continued west," Sarah mused as she and Wyatt sat on their porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of pink and gold. "If I had reached California and lived with Aunt Margaret." Wyatt's hand covered hers where it rested on her rounded stomach. "Unhappiness, from the sound of that letter," he said frankly. "Some people are not meant to nurture others." Sarah nodded, feeling the baby move beneath their joined hands. "I believe everything happened as it was meant to," she said. "All the hardships, all the lonely times, they led me here to you, to this life we're building." Wyatt smiled, the same smile that had first melted her reserve almost a year ago. "To think it all began because you were too stubborn to accept help with your water buckets," he teased. "And you were too stubborn to take no for an answer," Sarah countered, laughing. "Best stubbornness I ever displayed," Wyatt said, leaning over to kiss her softly. "Because it led me to you, Sarah Colton. And there's nowhere else I'd rather be than right here, with you and our child." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deepening purples and blues, Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that she had found what she had been searching for all along, not in the distant promise of California, but here in the Arizona desert, with a man who had simply wanted to take care of her, and in doing so had given her the greatest gift of all: a place to belong, a love to cherish, and a future bright with promise. William Colton was born on a hot July morning in 1876, almost exactly 1 year after his parents' first meeting. He arrived with a lusty cry and a shock of dark hair that mimicked his father's, though his eyes were the same clear green as his mother's. "He's perfect," Wyatt whispered, cradling his son with a mixture of awe and terror after the midwife had cleaned and swaddled the infant. "Sarah, look what we've done." Exhausted but radiant, Sarah reached out to touch her son's tiny fist, which immediately curled around her finger with surprising strength. "Hello, William," she murmured. "We've been waiting for you." The first months of William's life passed in a blur of joy and exhaustion. He proved to be a strong, healthy baby with a determined temperament that made both parents laugh in recognition. "He's as stubborn as both of us combined," Wyatt observed one night as they finally succeeded in getting the fussing infant to sleep. "Heaven help us when he learns to walk and talk." Life settled into new rhythms built around William's needs. The horse breeding business continued to thrive, with Wyatt's reputation for quality animals spreading throughout the territory. Sarah, once William was a few months old, began to take on some of the business correspondence, discovering she had a talent for the record-keeping and communication that Wyatt found tedious. Their circle of friends in Sweetwater expanded. What had once been Sarah's place of temporary residence became truly her home, filled with people who cared for her family and connections that grew deeper with time. On William's first birthday, they hosted a gathering at their ranch, which Wyatt had officially named Cottonwood Springs. Friends from town joined them in celebrating not just their son's milestone, but also the anniversary of when Sarah and Wyatt had first met. "Hard to believe it's been 2 years since I saw you struggling with those water buckets," Wyatt said as they stood together watching their guests enjoy the party, William asleep against his father's shoulder after the excitement of the day. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Sarah replied, smoothing a hand over their son's dark curls. "And sometimes it feels like we've always been together." The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. A drought in 1878 tested their resources, forcing Wyatt to make difficult decisions about which horses to keep and which to sell. The railroad came to Sweetwater in 1879, bringing new opportunities for business, but also changing the character of the town they had grown to love. Through it all, their partnership remained strong, each challenge faced together, each joy magnified by being shared. They added to their family in 1880 with the birth of Elizabeth, a fair-haired daughter whose gentle nature balanced her brother's more boisterous personality. By the time William was 5 and Elizabeth 2, Cottonwood Springs had grown into one of the most respected small horse breeding operations in the territory. The original cabin had been expanded to a comfortable house, and additional structures, a proper barn, bunkhouse for the hired hands, and a workshop dotted the property. On warm evenings, the family often gathered on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset just as Sarah and Wyatt had done in the early days of their marriage. William would regale them with elaborate stories of his imaginary adventures, while Elizabeth contentedly arranged and rearranged her collection of polished stones. "Did I ever tell you children about the day I met your mother?" Wyatt would sometimes ask, though both kids had heard the story countless times and would beg for it again. "She was carrying buckets of water in the heat," William would recite, knowing his part in the familiar tale. "And you said, 'Let me take care of you,'" Wyatt would finish, his eyes finding Sarah's across the porch, the love between them as strong as it had been that first day. And Sarah, watching her husband and children in the golden light of sunset, would reflect on how a simple act of kindness had changed the course of her life, how a stranger's offer of help had led to a love deeper and more enduring than she could have imagined. In the summer of 1885, as Cottonwood Springs celebrated its 10th year, and William prepared to attend school in Sweetwater, now a growing town with proper streets and a schoolhouse, Sarah received a letter that brought her past full circle. Her Aunt Margaret had passed away in San Francisco, leaving Sarah her modest estate. The lawyer's letter was formal but contained an unexpected personal note. "Your aunt often spoke of regret that she had not made more effort to know you and your family. She kept the few letters you sent, including the photographs of your children, in a special box by her bedside." That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah shared the letter with Wyatt as they sat on their porch, a ritual that had not changed in all their years together. "How do you feel about it?" Wyatt asked gently, knowing that Sarah's relationship with her aunt had been complicated. Sarah considered the question, watching the familiar landscape as twilight descended. "Sad, I suppose, that we never truly knew each other, that she never met you or the children." She paused, her hand finding Wyatt's as it had countless times before, but also grateful in a strange way. "Grateful?" Wyatt's eyebrow lifted in question. "If she had been warmer in her invitation all those years ago, I might have been more determined to reach California," Sarah explained. "I might have passed through Sweetwater without staying. I might never have been carrying water buckets on that hot July day when a kind cowboy offered to help." Understanding dawned in Wyatt's eyes. "And I might never have found the courage to say those words that changed everything." "Let me take care of you," Sarah quoted softly. "The best words I ever spoke," Wyatt said, drawing her close. "Though I think we've taken care of each other all these years." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that sometimes the most important journeys are not the ones we plan, but the ones that find us when we least expect them, like a chance encounter on a dusty street, a simple offer of help, and the love that grows from such modest beginnings into a life more beautiful than we could have imagined.